Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Duncan MacPherson. First I'll look at the background of this case, including the timeline of the incident, then offer my analysis. Duncan Alvin MacPherson was born on February 3, 1966, in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Canada. He was raised by his parents, Bob and Linda. When he was very young, Duncan took an interest in hockey. As an adult, he played in the Western Hockey League for a team called the Saskatoon Blades. In 1984, he was drafted by the New York Islanders, but he was plagued by frequent injuries and was cut from the team in the spring of 1988. This put Duncan in a bad position. He needed to find some way to make a living. He started talking to a man named Ron Dixon, who had purchased a semi-professional hockey team in Dundee, Scotland, called the Tigers. Ron was interested in hiring Duncan to coach the team and to function part-time as a player. The men scheduled a meeting in Scotland for Saturday, August 12, 1989. They planned on signing an agreement during that meeting, and Duncan would start working for the team on Monday, August 14. On August 2, 1989, Duncan flew from Canada to Europe to start his new adventure. He left earlier than necessary because he wanted to visit friends and do some sightseeing. On August 4, Duncan visited a friend named George in Nuremberg, Germany. On Monday, August 7, Duncan borrowed George's red Opel Corsa hatchback. This small front-wheel drive car is extremely popular in Europe. This particular vehicle probably had somewhere between 45 and 55 horsepower, which means its 0 to 60 time would be listed as eventually or maybe, depending on the direction of the wind. Duncan's plan was to visit a few places and return George's car on August 11. This way Duncan could board a plane for Scotland and get to his interview on August 12. He drove 3 hours south to Füssen, Germany, right on the border with Austria, to visit another friend. Duncan left that friend's house on Tuesday, August 8. He had contact with Ron Dixon about 2 days later. Duncan still planned on attending the meeting and starting work as scheduled. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary. On August 12, 1989, the day of the meeting, Duncan failed to show up. A few days later, Ron Dixon contacted Duncan's parents, who reported him missing on August 20 and traveled to Europe to look for him on August 27. On September 22, 1989, Duncan's parents learned that the Opel Corsa that Duncan had borrowed from George was at the Stubai Glacier ski resort in Austria. This is 90 miles south of Füssen, Germany. The vehicle was in the parking lot near the gondola station. It contained many of Duncan's belongings, including his passport, but there was no sign of Duncan. Here is what the police found during the course of their investigation. On Wednesday, August 9, 1989, one day after Duncan left Füssen, Germany, he arrived at the ski resort in Austria. A ski resort employee named Walter said that Duncan took a snowboarding lesson in the morning. He rented a snowboard and ski boots from a store at the resort called the Sport Shop 3000. After the lesson, Duncan's turtleneck and sweater were soaked due to sweating, so he purchased a sweatshirt. He left his turtleneck, sweater, and a belt hanging in Walter's office, presumably with the intent of picking them up later. Duncan had lunch with Walter at the ski resort before going back to the ski slope to practice snowboarding in the afternoon. Walter's girlfriend, who also worked at the ski resort, saw Duncan at 2:30 p.m. using the T-bar lift on the Schaufelferner Glacier. This was the last known sighting of Duncan. He vanished without a trace. The ski slope Duncan had been on was accessed from the Eisgrot mountain station. This was 3,800 vertical feet from the gondola station. A person looking to ski on that slope could hike or take the gondola to the mountain station. Those were the only two ways to get there or to get back. At the end of the day, Walter noticed that Duncan's clothing was still hanging in his office, but he didn't think too much about this because Duncan indicated he was coming back the next morning for another lesson. Staff at the ski resort stated that the snowboard Duncan had rented had been returned. They no longer had the rental log, but they claimed that none of the snowboards were missing. Therefore, Duncan must have brought it back. This led the police to believe that Duncan did not go missing from the slope while he was snowboarding, but rather from another part of the glacier while he was hiking. The police searched for Duncan on the glacier for 3 days, but had no success. Nobody knew what happened to him. Did he die on the glacier? Was he the victim of foul play? The case was a mystery. Duncan's parents continued to make regular trips to Austria in an effort to find out what happened to their son, but they had no success. Years passed with no new information about the case. This changed on July 18, 2003, about 14 years after Duncan MacPherson went missing. At about 3 p.m. that day, employees at the Snowboarder ski resort contacted the police and said they found a corpse on the Schaufelferner Glacier. The body belonged to Duncan MacPherson. Duncan was in a shallow crevasse, 82 feet east of the T-bar lift, which was in the middle of the ski slope. Later, the police told the Canadian Embassy that Duncan's body was found 393 feet east of the T-bar lift. This is outside the ski area. This was untrue and made it sound like Duncan was to blame, as if he wandered outside of the designated ski area. Duncan's body had sustained significant trauma. Both his forearms and hands were amputated, and his left leg was amputated both above and below the knee. His lower left leg had been destroyed. The fractures of his limbs were described as sharp and linear. His clothing was cut and torn. Even though the ski resort claimed that Duncan returned the snowboard he rented was found with his body. It had been cut apart, as if it had made contact with the rotating blades of some type of machine. Even though Duncan's death seemed incredibly suspicious, the authorities refused to perform an autopsy. From the beginning, they did not seem too interested in conducting a thorough investigation. For instance, as Duncan's body was being retrieved from the ski slope, an officer only spent 7 minutes at the scene. To explain all the unusual fractures that Duncan had sustained, investigators blamed moving ice. Over the 14 years he was in the shallow crevasse, his body moved about 130 feet down the glacier. The pressures on his body could have caused the damage. They said there was nothing suspicious about his death. He probably fell into the crevasse and died from hypothermia. They considered the case to be closed. Now moving to my analysis. Duncan's parents, and many other people who have looked into Duncan's death, do not believe the official story offered by the police. Instead, they believe that Duncan must have become injured while snowboarding, as he was on the ski slope waiting for help to arrive, or perhaps as he was unconscious. A Snowcat fitted with a tiller approached his position on the slope. These machines were used for snow grooming every day after the slopes closed at 4 p.m. The driver of the Snowcat did not see Duncan on the slope because it was foggy. The Snowcat did not run over Duncan with the tracks, but the tiller, which was towed behind the machine, caught Duncan's arms and his left leg. The tiller also ripped into the snowboard. After realizing what happened, the driver, or someone else, moved Duncan's body into the shallow crevasse, where it was found 14 years later. This, of course, is a pretty serious accusation, which the police in Austria have dismissed. They further indicated that even if a Snowcat driver did kill Duncan, nothing could be done about it as far as the law is concerned. Under this homicide theory, the killing was still not intentional. Rather, it was an accident, or at worst, caused by negligence. Even if it was considered negligence, which would be criminal, the statute of limitations expired a long time ago. Despite the unwillingness of the police to further investigate and their inability to file charges even if they found wrongdoing, there are many people who would like the truth to come out. This brings me to the question, did Duncan MacPherson die by accident at the Snowboarder ski resort? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that his death involved no foul play, starting with the factors that support this theory. Duncan was last seen on the ski slope, presumably getting ready to snowboard. 14 years later, he was found dead on that same slope. It stands to reason that he became injured and died from hypothermia. His body was not found because it was in a shallow crevasse and became covered with snow. Duncan did sustain a number of unusual fractures, which is suspicious, but he was in that crevasse for 14 years. The movement of the glacier could have caused all types of injuries during that time. The force exerted by the glacier is much more powerful than a tiller. It's also possible that Duncan's injuries were caused by a tiller towed by a Snowcat, but the damage was inflicted after his death. Perhaps the operator of the Snowcat didn't realize that Duncan had been struck. Under this theory, contact with the tiller explains Duncan's injuries, but the driver did not cause Duncan's death. It was a post-mortem collision. No foul play was involved. Now moving to the factors that contradict the theory that Duncan's death involved no foul play. A parking lot attendant at the ski resort claimed that the car that Duncan had borrowed was parked after September 1, 1989. This, of course, was not true. He parked there on August 9, 1989. The ski resort closed at 4 p.m. that day. Why did employees ignore the fact that Duncan's car was in the parking lot? This is a pretty good indicator that a customer has been left behind on the glacier. Whether or not Duncan was killed by a tiller, the ski resort should have never left him on the slope alone. The elevation of the glacier was 10,000 feet. A person left there would be at severe risk of hypothermia. In Duncan's wallet, the police found forms of identification except his driver's license from Saskatchewan. A driver's license was a common item for the rental shop to keep when somebody rented a snowboard. Why did ski resort employees claim that Duncan had returned the snowboard when it was clear he did not? Also, didn't it strike them as unusual that he left his clothing hanging in the office of an employee and never came back to get it? Near Duncan's body, there was a blue work glove, a red ski glove, and a pair of blue cross-country ski gloves. Certainly, all these gloves did not belong to Duncan. Who did the extra gloves belong to, and why were they there? This is consistent with the theory that people moved his body after he died, maybe to conceal what happened to him. The injuries that Duncan sustained and the damage to the snowboard were consistent with being caught up in a machine with rotating metal components, like a tiller. These machines were regularly used in the area where Duncan's body was found. One would have been operating there starting 1.5 hours after he was last spotted on the slope. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Duncan's death involved no foul play? In my opinion, no. I think that his death did involve foul play. I'm not convinced he was run over by a tiller, at least not when he was alive, but leaving Duncan on the slope could have led to his death. That behavior could be considered criminally negligent. Someone should have been held responsible for failing to notice Duncan had not returned to the gondola station. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. When Duncan was snowboarding, he became injured and waited in a shallow crevasse for someone to help him. For some reason, the staff at the ski resort never recognized or cared that he was missing. They knew his car was in the gondola station parking lot. They knew his clothing was in an employee's office. And they knew he never returned the rented snowboard. Yet they did nothing. Duncan died from hypothermia and was covered with snow. Most, if not all, of his fractures were caused by movement of the glacier or being run over by a tiller after he was dead. After the body was found and the police investigated, they were not helpful. They did not want to make a big deal out of Duncan's death. Maybe he was killed by a tiller. Maybe he died from hypothermia after the staff failed to recognize he was missing. Perhaps no one was to blame, and it was just a terrible accident. As far as the police were concerned, whatever the cause, the case was closed. It was time to let the past remain in the past. Once the statute of limitations expired for any offense that could have been involved, the police had yet another reason to remain inactive. At this point, I believe no progress will ever be made with Duncan's case. An autopsy was never performed, and Duncan's body was cremated. Even if the police were interested in pursuing the case solely for the sake of discovering the truth, there is nowhere to go with the investigation. There is nothing else left to study. They missed their opportunity to solve the mystery. Those are my thoughts on the case of Duncan MacPherson. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. But one thing I've noticed when looking at a large number of investigations from all over the world is that the authorities tend to be a little bit lazier when they're dealing with a victim who came from outside of their country. This is like the stranger in a strange land phenomenon. They don't want to worry about it. They have enough problems in their own country. They have to worry about budgets and corruption, and all kinds of other problems, they don't want to spend money and waste time on trying to find justice for somebody who was visiting the nation. Again, I don't know if that's what happened in the case of Austria. Their police department actually has a pretty good reputation as far as corruption. It has a very low level. But it seems like that may have been what happened here. Maybe they just didn't want to be bothered. Duncan was from Canada, not from Austria. He died on a ski slope. Whatever the cause, it is what it is. They can't go back and fix it. Why spend a lot of money and time potentially only to find grief for them? Even though it would be finding the truth for the family, it would just be unpleasant for the police in Austria. Maybe they didn't want to know the truth. Again, they had problems of their own to worry about. They had investigations that involved citizens of Austria. So I think that's something to keep in mind when people travel. A lot of countries go out of their way to make tourists feel at home. They want them to come back and spend more money. But if something terrible happens, it's not possible to always count on those countries to conduct an investigation that's of the same quality as one they would perform for a citizen of that nation.